Again, the Fresh Convo. We have an open conversation, so it's an open format. Not We don't actively invite people in to join the conversation. Everyone is welcome that wants to join. Feel free to tag into the conversation. We ask you to do that by posing your question or your whatever you want to do in the chat or raising your hand, and then Koen and I will make sure that you will get the stage and can join in. As I said, the Fresh Convo is an initiative by Fresh Venture Studio and the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture podcast. We focus very much on everything that needs to be built in this space to transition towards a more regenerative food system. So we are focusing on venture opportunities or everything there, but obviously they come forward from the problems that we see. Today we actually do it a little bit different than normally. We have a little bit more focus where we zoom in on the question around empowering farmers and food chains with regenerative knowledge. And that ties into also the fact that Koen actually is at the Climate Farmers event. Koen, hello, how are you doing?
Hello. I'm doing very well. I'm missing a walk now outside, so I'm happy and not happy because it's very cold. But it's we're in quite a nice, the only, I think, castle owned by farmers, set up by farmers in let's say southern Germany. So everything here breathes farmers and breathes organic agriculture mostly, and so it's a perfect place to meet for the first time. I think the climate farmers movement, if we can call it like that, meeting for a congress in Europe at least. So many farmers together from all over Europe. I lost count how many different countries we have present here. So that's quite a unique place at the moment.
Cool. Well, we'll get back to you in a little bit, and one of our colleagues, Olivier, is also at the event. So we'll zoom in what's happening there. I think it's interesting to get the perspective, and also specifically around what's happening around knowledge within the sector and how knowledge can be a leverage in the transition, I think. Before we get into that conversation, I think it's always good to see a little bit more faces than just Koen and mine. So let's meet the people in the room. We are actually going to do a quick breakout, very quick, like 1 or 2 minutes, where we ask you to introduce yourself and the mission you are personally working on to someone else that is also in the room. So I'm gonna ask Aisling to start the breakout rooms, and then we will be back in 1 or 2 minutes. All right, everyone. I think we're all back. So great to see you all. I actually wanted to get to Koen. So as I said earlier, Koen is at the Climate Farmers event. Koen, maybe you can tell a little bit more about what's happening there and what the vibe is, but also in a more general sense, what are learnings that if you catched up the past month since last time we talked?
Yeah, sure. So here about 50 to 60, mostly farmers gathering from all the way from Hungary, from Finland, Spain, Portugal, quite a few, the Netherlands, obviously, Germany and France and Italy. Different sizes, quite a few smaller scale ones. So the younger farmers, a big issue, as we have seen a few times, is obviously access to land, especially if you haven't been born into a farming family. So then naturally, whatever you can afford will be smaller scale. There are a few larger ones here as well, but they come from larger families, farming families. I think the overall theme, a lot of enthusiasm, very different issues from too much water in the north of Germany to way too little or not at the right time in Portugal. But the conclusions or the directions are very similar. Different diets focused on perennials. So everybody is looking at agroforestry systems, even though in some places it's not allowed. Everybody's looking at complexifying their farms, complexifying their economic systems as well. There's a lot of talk, obviously, around ecosystem services. Very little action yet. How to be paid for biodiversity, water storage, carbon. I mean, carbon is on everybody's tongue, but nobody has yet to figure out how to get paid for that at a meaningful scale. Policy, there's many things here that these farmers are doing. These are really, I would say, the cutting edge, especially of the smaller scale ones. Many things they are doing are not necessarily fully allowed in terms of integrating trees and animals in the same systems on the same land. In many places, that's simply unheard of, and in some places actually illegal. Some stories here of I have to remove my market garden if the local municipality finds out that I'm not only growing XYZ but actually vegetables, which is absurd if you think about it, but that is the reality for many. So I think it's a good optimism, but also an incredibly hard transition or hard journey that many of these and many of the other people I talked to in the last month since the last one we discussed are on. So let's not underestimate. It's not a bit of no-till, a few trees here and there, and some animals, and then you're fine. This is an incredible hard thing we ask farmers to do, and they need all the support they can get, and that's the ecosystem services. But simply here as well, the underlying theme comes back to better markets for my products, better payment conditions. If I start diversifying and I don't have one cash crop anymore, what does that do to my markets and my business models, etc. And in terms of knowledge sharing, very interestingly here, what climate farmers found out is the best thing that has been happening in the past period they've been working on it is really WhatsApp sharing. Like the amount of farmers that are communicating through WhatsApp, not to big groups, maybe 50 is sort of a limit, but sharing pictures, practices, compost practices, questions, challenges. And there's a huge need for farmers to connect to each other and to share what they are focusing on, working on. I mean, I was just at a table with a Hungarian farmer and one from Portugal. The Hungarian one sells everything in advance. So the chicken operation they have is fully sold in the winter before they even start in spring. And you saw the Portuguese like looking up like, oh, I should really get into that because I'm really struggling with low margins. So there's a lot to learn, even if you're in a completely different context. They are all battling with the same market forces that we have all created. And they all need better markets and better access. But the knowledge part, it's fascinating. It doesn't really matter the language. People just are very hungry for how to intercrop, how to work at the scales, how to market, how to finance. And so it's yeah, it feels like we're early, but it's definitely interesting. And yeah, the market discussion keeps coming back. Like everybody needs better markets. And also their knowledge, like how to direct market if you can do that or want to do that, how to sell online, how to get better contracts with your off-takers, wholesalers, etc. And it really depends where you are if that's available. In some countries, there's not so much interest yet. Some stories in the Netherlands, not really that easy. If you're trying to sell to supermarkets, they really don't care about it. And in other places like Austria, that's much easier because there's much more of a focus on quality in Southern European countries as well. So it really depends, but the principles, I mean, there's an immense amount. You see here, the coffee breaks, you end up being a lot longer because everybody is deep in conversation, which is a good sign for a conference.
Cool. Yeah, I have a little bit more questions maybe on what you see as because Climate Farmers is one of the organizations trying to bridge the knowledge gap by connecting, and they're doing a lot more. But if we can get back to that, I'm eager to learn a little bit from Olivier as well. What his feelings are with the event so far, and on the subject. So Olivier, maybe you can briefly introduce yourself and then. Also share your insights, and then it might be good to add you.
Yeah, thanks for that. Hi everyone, I'm Olivier. I'm working together with Fresh and Metabolic, working on the agri-food system and trying to transition that to a sustainable state. Working a lot around what are the leverage points, what are the key barriers preventing that change, and how can we solve those challenges. Here at the Farmers Conference, I think Koen already mentioned a lot of things. The diversity of different types of farmers is very interesting, from large scale to small scale. But some themes keep coming back, and those are all around, like Koen already mentioned, market access. But another theme that definitely comes back is how do we actually measure that we are regenerating something? How can we have a system that verifies that? And who will implement this, and how can we make sure that the money that could become available through this actually lands in the seat of the farmer and doesn't get stuck somewhere along the supply chain of that verification system. That's a big concern for farmers, and especially because this new influx of money that could come from things like carbon credits plus or biodiversity payments would enable a lot of farmers to start changing their practices and would encourage farmers to move to more regenerative practices. And a lot of the discussions are around that, obviously. How can we implement regenerative practices? What does that mean in different contexts? And that can vary a lot based on the location that farmers are at. So it's really interesting to hear a farmer in Portugal talk about water and how that influences their operation, and a farmer in Finland, for example, who has plenty of water and doesn't have to worry about this, but then has to worry that in the winter, for example, the cows on the field don't sink into the field if the soil is too wet. So the exchange of knowledge is very, very interesting to hear the different perspectives. And I think one of the other underlying learnings here is that the farmers are learning so much from each other, and they're voicing this need for a network of farmers that communicate with each other, especially at a regional scale. So farmers can exchange knowledge with each other and help each other in their own context to transition to regenerative agriculture. But equally, if we're talking about market opportunities and ways of production, there's a lot of inspiration to be had on a larger scale. Koen mentioned the example of the Hungarian farmer inspiring a Portuguese farmer to maybe sell it in a different way. And this exchange has been proving very valuable, I think.
All right, thank you, Olivier. There's a bunch of stuff I want to respond to as well. But thank you so far. Before we get into it, I would also like to invite Murray Gray, because we're focusing now a little bit on this knowledge, specifically on this knowledge aspect. And Murray, I would like you to share a little bit of the thinking you did there as well, and maybe some of the questions we have around what is this knowledge gaps. Olivier is talking about this need for networks, and what have you seen so far? Can you give us a quick intro?
Yeah, sure. So just to sort of base some context, at Fresh, we see there are sort of 9 big cross-cutting missions, whether it be about terrestrial production, aquatic production, or landless food production, that we see as really key. And one of those is really how we disseminate knowledge about regenerative practices, right? I think, a lot of what you're talking about has resonated, and I think the 3, given some of the challenges that you've talked about, like 3 sort of big questions that I've been thinking about are across, and I'll get into them in detail, but, accessibility, the context, specificity, and diversity point that you both talked about, but also if we're going to try and address this, how do we do this at scale too, right? So in terms of accessibility, I think, we talked about lots of different locations. We got farmers with different socioeconomic status. We've got different languages. Maybe a lot of stuff is in English right now. We've probably got different levels of digital accessibility, and probably many other factors that enable or prevent farmers from accessing knowledge, right? So I think that's one thing I'm particularly interested in. A second thing is, this great diversity that both Ollie and I think Koen talked about, and I've been thinking about it in relation to, is it actually underlying, given this diversity, do we actually need underlying research into these things in these different contexts? Is it that we have the research and actually, just need to find a way to, develop knowledge to share around that? Or is it actually about more demonstrable cases of these things working in practice? And then how do we sort of accelerate these things, given we have all these different contexts we talked about based on farm type, based on climate zone, based on all the different sort of accessibility issues I talked about earlier. And the third thing about scalability is really, while we bear in mind that context specificity and huge diversity we have, if we actually wanted to really try and get knowledge to spread, how do we do that at scale while also keeping it sort of context specific where relevant? And what are those levers we can use to really accelerate and have scalability for this knowledge? So I think those are the 3 big questions that came out of some of the work that we did. And, also things I'd love for us to maybe dig into 1 or 2 of those today too.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. Maybe Olivier, you want to respond?
Yeah. So let's start with the first one. It's the accessibility of the knowledge that you mentioned. It depends on the context that you're working in. In some countries, let's take for example France, there is a lot of knowledge and there are already a lot of networks set up for farmers to access that knowledge and share knowledge with each other. And those are organized by mainly NGOs or through government support. But let's look at, for example, Hungary or Estonia. The farmers here are asking how can we access knowledge of how to do this in a large scale, because there's not a lot of independent consultants available in those countries to be able to service the farmers in their transition. Language is definitely sometimes a barrier. The people at the conference here, we all speak English, so that's convenient. But it's only the avant-garde, let's say, of farmers engaging in the space that is actually present here at the conference. It's not the growth of farmers. And we notice that language barrier is something that definitely should be overcome. But in general, I think the knowledge is there. It's transferable to different contexts. It has to be adapted. And depending on the country you're in, that's either accessible through, at this point, experts, consultants, or it's not available at this point. I think that's the conclusion. And solutions that farmers here are talking about this are setting up larger networks to share with each other, but also, like Marie mentioned, demonstration farms. So one of the sessions here hosted was about how can we have a European-wide network of demonstration farms, and how do we deal with things like language? How can we make sure that farmers can access the knowledge of those demonstration farms across Europe and get inspired and implement different practices on their farm? So I think it's an interesting conversation, but there is definitely a lot of gaps still there, depending on which country you're in. And I think this also touches on the point of scalability, right, Marie? You mentioned how can we make sure that there is knowledge available for everyone? Because at this point, there is experts in Europe, but this is a nucleus of knowledge, and they can physically only service so much farmers. So for example, there are some consultants we're working together with. They are limited. They are saying, I'm consulting on more than 100,000 hectares. I physically can't consult more than 100,000 hectares. I would love to consult more, but I am out of capacity. And I think this is where Fresh comes in, and where a lot of tools can be developed or opportunities can be created to how can we distribute this knowledge? How can we make it accessible at an accessible price point also for farmers, because consulting services are not always cheap. And how can that knowledge be distributed in that way?
I'm curious, Ollie, maybe Koen too, right? Let's say, if we removed the limit of a consultant, let's say, not being able to travel to every possible farm. I mean, is it realistic that, a really, really skilled consultant and expert, could they navigate all the different contexts that we have around Europe? Or are they going to be really like areas where, areas of knowledge where fundamentally it's so different that, they're going to be a bit stuck, and they need someone who's got real local knowledge, right? How much do you see that as a limiter, or theoretically, if we could multiply one of the best expert we have, right, 1,000 times and spread them all over Europe, could they actually fundamentally help everyone? How do you see that?
Okay, I'll go. There are experts who can navigate the different contexts, but they are obviously, let's give an example. There's an expert in the UK, and I know he's going to Portugal as well to consult on farms there. But obviously he doesn't have all the sensitivities of how a local market system might work, or how a local the farming mindset might work. So in terms of agronomy advice, there is definitely crossover, and people who are very skilled can navigate across different contexts. But I would say that this is probably not the majority of consultants. So very skilled individuals, obviously, they're out there, but we do need more local consultants, so to speak. We can't expect consultants to be hopping around all the place in that sense.
Yeah, and I think we've seen some attempts from some of the top consultants globally to somehow digitalize their work. I haven't seen super successful examples, to be honest, but I think you can learn a lot from it to a certain extent, and then you need local knowledge, or then you need to tap into the books that were written 100 years ago in your area about the different crop types together, and then adapt it to, like there's a certain number of steps you can probably take within, let's say, a consultant not from your region, but at some point you need to tap into different sources of knowledge. But it doesn't mean that those steps aren't very meaningful, because if we can scale one of the consultants or augment him or her to consult on 1 million hectares, and 1 million hectares take 4 steps, and that's a huge amount of impact. And then hopefully they continue with step 5, 6, and 7 with local advice or local knowledge, etc. So I think, but the fact that we haven't seen successful examples globally, we have seen some very successful consultants that could basically be traveling the globe if it wasn't for COVID, consistently and consult everywhere. Tells me that either they don't want to, because maybe it is nice to visit these farms and work on these farms and not do this from a laptop and from a VR glasses, etc. Or we haven't figured out a way to do it yet. Doesn't mean it's not possible, but we haven't seen, or at least I haven't seen, successful examples. But I think the basic first steps for most farmers are relatively the same in many cases, and you can get pretty far with a general but still specific to the farm advice. But you're at some point you need to go deeper and deeper, and but maybe you're ready then to do it yourself as well. So I think there's a case there to try. I'm just wondering why we haven't seen it from some of these, but maybe because they really approached it from their consultancy business, which was based on visiting and revisiting, and yet there's a very quick limit of how much hectares you can actually yearly or every 2 years visit and do. And we've seen some examples with, or trials with, I think, Zach Weiss, who is a master in terms of landscape restoration when it comes to water, who's been trying to train others to be like him, almost to clone himself. It's not easy, obviously, because you don't have, I mean, it's very difficult to build a team of consultants that is at the same level and the same, because these are all very specific people. And so it's not that easy, but I think there is a case for technology-based first next steps of a journey of a farmer, how to make sure you don't always have to send somebody there that costs thousands of euros easily, just to simply get somebody there and pay for his or her time. So there's a case there. I don't think we've cracked yet. And I saw a quick question of Megan, what are demonstration farms? I mean, means different things to different people, but mainly farmers in the local context. I think what we mean here, or at least here on the conference, is a way you can see things at a reasonable scale in your context that you could apply on your farm. So you can see these systems, you can see agroforestry systems instead of just on a video far away. You can actually see it in your local context and walk through, ask questions to the farmer, etc., to demonstrate what is possible in your biome, in your watershed, in your region. So the argument of this doesn't work here because nobody's doing it, it only works in southern France, or it only works in Canada, etc., is not valid anymore, because there's something nearby you that is actually showing that some of these systems can work. But of course, we can discuss about what demonstration actually means.
I have a question or direction also, but I want to mention that anyone can jump in. So if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat. It's a bit around, and it ties into what you were saying, Olivier, about are we actually regenerating, and sort of the measurement, and we touched upon it earlier. Like, you see all this data analysis from different perspectives and needs being done, and often that not being integrated. So on the one hand, for example, the known organization that wants to know that what they're buying is actually regenerating, so they're doing all types of analysis. On the one hand, other groups like ecosystem valorization or carbon marketplaces, they require different data sets, and then you have actually working on the farm, knowing what's happening on the land, having it as insight to steer, and these worlds being so seemingly divided. I think that's something you, Koen, might know something about, but Olivier, you dived into. Like, it's so spread out also, all these people getting knowledge and not always being geared towards practicality. On the other hand, I've also seen with, for example, with Soil Heroes, quite practical sort of approaches that you can implement as part of sort of measuring tools, actually, which also function as knowledge databases almost. What do we see happening there, and what do we see as needs there? Because I feel there's a gap as well.
Yeah, you have a lot of different actors coming into the space who are very interested in what is regeneration and how can we regenerate. But they're coming at it from different perspectives. So an agri-food processor wants to know, how can I reduce the footprint of my supply chain? So they might be very, very interested in knowing exactly how much carbon is being sequestered through farms that they source their products from. Building those data sets to really, really accurately measure that is quite challenging. So there's different models that are being built at this point that are trying to estimate how that, what that might look like and how much carbon could be sequestered. But they are a model and they're an estimation of that. So there's a lot of data around this. How do we estimate soil carbon? How is that being sequestered, for how long, and how can it be translated into something that we can monetize on, that we can sell for farmers usually, but for people more up in the supply chain to measure, to make sure that they're not having a negative impact or reducing their impact at least. But we're equally looking at, for example, financial data, which is quite a struggle for farmers, because not many farmers are keeping a very tight record of their financials, and they don't have necessarily a good overview of the financial performance of their farm. On that scale, there's a lot of vacuum, and there's programs from the EU that have different farms where they source that data from, and they try to model what that would look like for the whole country. But again, that's a rough estimate, a rough model, and there's a lot of questions of how do we connect those different scales with each other? How can we incentivize a farmer to input data, or how can we have programs that actually measure different elements on the farm? Financial things are one part, but equally, what are the practices? How is it being implemented? What is actually happening? Regeneration, not only carbon, but also biodiversity, water retention. There's so many factors that come together, and it's quite challenging to bring that all together in one space, because we're talking about a lot of different things. We're talking about finance, we're talking about carbon, we're talking about biodiversity, and they're all kind of different worlds with different data sets, which makes it very challenging to navigate. Yeah, so there's a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different interests, a lot of different data sets, a lot of different goals with those data sets as well.
Yeah, one of the things I was thinking about is that I heard the Dutch Hyperloop company, they were talking about that now there are so many organizations working on Hyperloop, and then there's a lot happening, and it's a very diversified field, and then the risk is that everyone develops their own standards, right? And apparently we made that mistake quite often already, also with the training network. I think that's one of the reasons why trains are still such a problem, not get a European train system, because we all have different standards. It doesn't work well. We need to shift the trains to actually develop sort of a base framework. Like we are not the solution. We only deliver the central language that we need, or something that can be built upon for all these different actors, to make sure that there's a sort of a common language or a common standard in this aspect that anyone can build new tools on, or something like that. Is that happening already? Do we see that?
There are some initiatives that are doing this. Recently, an initiative from the UK that came out, Global Farmer Impact, if I'm right. They are developing a framework. They're still developing it. They're developing it together with a lot of different actors, universities, farmers, but also agri-food businesses, to have a common framework to try to start measuring some of these things and be able to apply that throughout the world. That's their goal, at least. But equally, for example, today in the conversations we had about carbon credits, one of the topics that came forward is it's a very, very complex thing. And we actually might need something as a round table on verification systems, where a lot of organizations in Europe come together to discuss this together and bring this space further. Because it is at this point really a market where, or a race almost, of all these different stakeholders and companies trying to build their verification system. A lot of the times to be able to streamline certain ecosystem service payments or carbon credits. And definitely there is room for that to be streamlined and to actually make that something that is European-wide at least, or could even be applied further. One challenge that the farmers brought forward in the discussions we had today is that it shouldn't be something that is prescriptive and that says the farmer exactly what he has to do on his or her land. And that it needs to be adaptable to specific contexts. And this is one of the big challenges, and where the discussion kind of became very, very complex, because it is not easy to have one framework that fits every specific context. So that aspect of complexity is something that we still have to crack in a way, or we have to find an elegant solution for, I think.
All right. Thank you. Murray, you wanted to, I see you are having a few questions as well. You wanted to drop in, or I also see Radu, but maybe you can go first and then we can go to Radu.
We got a couple in the chat.
Oh, a couple in the chat even.
But yeah, okay. So I guess a different way of looking at it is, is it that, we need to think upstream and say, okay, who are new farmers who want to come into the space? And is our attention really well focused on really trying to sort of start from the beginning with new farmers coming into the space and fundamentally really trying to teach them from the ground up, sort of the fundamentals of this stuff, rather than trying to maybe convert existing farmers, let's say, because, there are new farmers coming through all the time. So I'm curious what you think about sort of, I guess, more of a top of the funnel approach, sort of in a few ways. Is it that we, to get more farmers on board, we need to fundamentally work on awareness as part of this too? Is it also that we should be sort of providing input to new farmers through the things like education farms, right? Is that more impactful? Or is it actually that we need to focus on existing farmers and converting them? And, are there any really great initiatives that you've seen in that space that are really looking top of the funnel? So I'm curious about that as well, if anyone's got any thoughts on it.
Ankita did raise her hand, but I'm not sure if she had thoughts on it or additional questions. So maybe
earlier question, yeah.
Shall we go to Ankita, or you first want to respond, Koen, and then go to Ankita?
No, go ahead to Ankita. I can respond later.
You wanted to answer to Murray, Ankita? Or you had a different question? And maybe you can introduce yourself briefly.
I had similar question, but little bit different, but a similar one. So the question is, farmers need to be motivated to come to the regenerative agriculture and to produce more. So there is a question that Murray is asking, how are we motivating more farmers? Are we onboarding more farmers? How are we educating them and stuff like that? But what I see is farmers are motivated when they see that produce is going to be used by someone, that whatever they're producing is actually worth. So how are we making, let's say, how are we pushing farmers to sell their produce to the local market? How are we going to do that? There is also this one channel. It's not just only about agriculture academy or knowledge gap or something like that, but normal people should also benefit from regenerative agriculture. So yeah, similar question, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's very the biggest motivation for farmers, even if you calculate the current prices for carbon and what it could do and ecosystem services to the bottom line, it's a nice extra, but it's not the best business model ever, and probably shouldn't be. So coming back to the markets, but it could all be all the way up from Danone, those walking around here, and others that are making huge commitments, and let's help them sourcing that, probably not from one farmer, but from different farmers, but all the way down to your farmers markets or better ways to organize that. I think there's a lot of work, and coming back to venture side of things, a lot of companies need to be built or need to be rebuilt or refocused around, okay, let's look at rotations, let's look at agroforestry systems, let's look at who is able to sell. If we push farmers in or nudge farmers in the direction, okay, you have to be diversified, great, but who's going to actually buy that stuff? Because the whole idea of one cash crop is something we've created over time, and it's biting us. But that means if farmers are planting different size of cover crops, is somebody going to buy it? Is that just a lost crop for the soil? Is it going to be grazed, and who's going to buy the meat? Is it like, what are we actually doing to make the financial stability of these farms much better? Because then you have a waiting line of farmers that want to transition tomorrow. But we need to look at their business models, and that comes back to what Murray and Olivier as well. These are companies. We need to treat them as companies, and simply not having your financial details. And like that simply means that it's going to be very difficult to ever raise transition finance, because you're never going to be able to show what you have in terms of cost and basically cost and profit and income. So I would say, great point, Ankita. How can we, not everybody can go to the farmer's market as a farmer. You might grow some kind of commodity things. We need to figure out better ways to source lentils, to source grain, to pay for quality, because at the moment we start paying for these transitions and pay for it, then many other farmers, many of their neighbors would be suddenly willing to go down the rabbit hole of knowledge, which is available to them, in maybe not in their perfect language, maybe not in their preferred language, but believe me, they will find out. If there's a market, people move, and at least enough people move to get this going further. And it probably means finding out new recipes for cookies, figuring out how to get more of complex rotations into products, and probably shifting diets. I mean, there's no way we're going to do it exactly the same. It's not, we can just replace a few things in the supermarket and be fine. This is a very big transition, and we, as let's say, the food industry, needs to play a big role in that, and that's going to come down to paying better, more, faster, and different. And that's not going to be easy. And probably that comes down to transparency, and not this anonymized commodity system where it doesn't matter where you source from, as long as it's called coffee beans, it's fine. And a lot of people that live of the non-transparency is not going to like it. But we need to demand it as consumers, we need to demand it as food people, and we need to demand it as farmers. Because in transparency, in non-transparency lives a lot of obscure things that we don't like. And it's a few companies have successfully showed that you can actually build businesses around transparency in costs. We can talk about true pricing, true costing, but let's first understand where the mangoes are actually coming from, what it actually costs to grow them in a way that we like it, and what do we decide as a fair profit on top of that for the wholesaler in the middle, or for the platform, or whoever gets it to your doorstep. And so we need to ask those questions, because as long as it's a long chain, and of course chain comes from the slavery period, somebody's going to lose, and it's usually the farmer. Sorry, it was a long rant.
Yeah, last time we had Jack Bean also joining in, right? Who sort of buys a landscape on a small scale, but they bought 15 acres that has been specifically grown for them, helping diversify a farmer, and then they are actively changing their recipe to actually being able to source locally and develop products that can drive this diversified.
Which is great, but let's see. I mean, there's a few hectares. Which,
it's really small. Yeah,
it's very small, but we need to follow that. Like, hey, let's use their creativity of cooking to do the rotations that we like to see, and get it on plates of as many people as possible for an okay price. And that probably means that they have to change their recipes a bit. And that's okay, because they are the creative ones that should translate it into flavor.
I hope to see a boom, an explosion of companies that will drive that, right? That's one of the things that we need to see happen, probably, and maybe from the corporate perspective, Koen and Olivier. But maybe first give Radu the stage before I get into it. But I wonder if, and I'll get into it later, not to forget the question, if farmers start to see all these promises that are made, the Nestle, we're going to buy landscapes and everybody is going to go regenerative, So the market is asking, you would say, are they actually noticing that it is happening? But before we get into that, I also want to give the stage to Radu to ask his question. Maybe Radu, you can ask your question yourself. You asked in the chat and unmute for us to see you as well.
Yeah, thanks, Bart. So it's a bit related with what was discussed before about incentives to farmers to transition to regenerative agriculture. And it seems, at least to an extent, that it's an elegant system to kind of pay them for the added value they bring to nature, to the environment. So how can you first measure those ecosystem services? And are there any models that are now working in paying this added value to the farmers? And then where is this money coming from? Is it from NGOs, governments, or it can be also a model where private entities can be included?
Shall I try to take a stab at this one?
Yes.
But we're very early, first of all. There are a few marketplaces out there. I will put some in the chat, mute, where both companies and individuals can pay for carbon to a certain extent. The water market seems more developed. That's really regional. So it really depends where you are. Like Region Network did a big deal with Microsoft. Nori is a place where you can do it as individual to compensate your year worth of carbon. The water market seems more developed and seems like water boards or water companies that need clean water for either drinking water or need clean water for hydropower or enough water, that making deals with farmers upstream to reduce runoff, to change practices that have been in places.
Whoa, Koen. I think your internet is dropping, Koen. Or you turn into a robot.
Probably in
it's
terms
one
of
the two.
changing farming practices, Australia. I think it's my internet.
Internet is doing horribly. Just to be clear for everyone, Koen is in a castle right now, and he has warned me already before that castle internet is not yet a big thing, I think. But Radu, maybe
Am I back, or it's really bad?
You are back. Yeah, you are back.
Okay. Where was I before Robo Voice took over?
Robo Voice took over quite quite a while back.
Quite soon. Okay. So I think it's the water market is quite developed. The biodiversity market is non-existent. And the credit, like the carbon credit, is starting to come, but very early. Australia has some examples around it, but not necessarily connected to soil, mostly to shrubs like above it. So you're being paid to not burn or not harvest or not graze. But it's very, very, very early stage, and nobody really has figured out all the details yet. A lot of cowboys in the market, so be aware. A lot of people promising all kinds of things. You can measure it from space to 1 meter deep in soil and all kinds of things that I haven't seen proven yet. There's a lot of sensors coming, which is great. It's clear on soil carbon, but it's a very messy period at the moment. Everybody calls ecosystem services. I've even heard some stories, I have to dive into it, that there's something coming on the NASDAQ that actually somehow listed some of these things. I will get back to that. I don't know the details yet. I heard somebody talk about it here, but you can definitely say we're in the Wild West at the moment in terms of ecosystem services. The ones that are paying, very clearly a number of front-running companies like Stripe is paying, Microsoft is paying, and individuals that are paying, but of course that's not so much. And Stripe is really taking a lead. They're paying for biochar credits, paying for enhanced weathering, which is rock dust credit, and basically paying for the research by buying credits, which is an interesting model at the moment. So I'll put some of that in the chat, but we're super early when it comes to biodiversity and other things. And water turns out to be very, very regional in many cases, but a very interesting one because you can sort of measure where it drops and where it flows to. So it's easier to follow, at least.
I think it's also interesting, like I don't think we had a convo, Koen, where ecosystem services didn't take up quite a bit of time, because it's always such an interesting a subject that really works as a magnet. There's a lot of interest there, I would say, And in the beginning, I had that as well. And now also working with farmers and seeing it as part of the business case and how small it still is. And like the promise is so big. And then also the cowboy world that it actually is based on models often. It's very unclear if it's actually what you're regenerating or capturing. So there's a lot happening there. And I personally think there are really great players in that field already working, but also it can turn very wrong, I would say. This is I mean, the ball is still rolling, I would say, but I really hope this is not going to be used for the wrong reasons almost. Murray, you want to chip in?
Yeah, I mean, I think also there's, I think number one is, there's a number of different people say there's like 14 different ecosystem services, right? Which are pretty variable. They're not just environmental. And it seems like there's quite a myopic focus on carbon, which is, I think, a indicator of where the narrative is at in general around climate change, like over biodiversity, for example, right? So that's one thing. And I also think there's quite a big focus on sort of the markets as a tool for this stuff, whereas it's sort of one of many ways in which to get paid for ecosystem services. And I think payments is one way to be incentivized to do it as well, right? So I think of the whole picture of ecosystem services, where actually there's a lot of focus in general, like across, this sort of a scene on actually what's like this, in my eyes at least, like that much actually, which is payments for carbon by corporates, right? But if you actually look at the whole scene, it's huge actually. And there's lots of different ways and levers that actually ecosystem services can be like incentivized, or people can be motivated to sort of provide them. So that's the only thing I wanted to chip in with, because I think it's a super fascinating world, and there's so many, there's such a wild west we've been talking about, and so many nuances around the payments for carbon alone. And that's before we even get into like oceans and carbon in oceans, which is another world entirely. There's also this other whole world around other stuff, which I think is also super interesting to dig into, right? So that's just the other thing that I'd like to say. Bart, please.
I would like you to get specific. So you're mentioning buying the carbon is one thing, but you mean the ecosystem services can also be part of other types of incentivizing. You mean like access to land, or leasing prices, or what do you mean exactly? What are the other levers related?
Well,
to
I guess like, okay, so there's one which is like sort of you have sort of markets. So you have like voluntary markets or compliance markets within that, right? You have philanthropies who might want to pay for outcomes. You have governments who might want to pay through subsidies. Other than that, you might have like command and control, where it's like you actually have to undertake these things, right? Or, wild idea, maybe people are intrinsically motivated to be stewards of the land and the payments. Now, this is like removing the fact that they need a business model to get paid for their work. But maybe there's also some who want to look at a landscape level or beyond the farm, and actually are thinking about how we're actually stewards of a wider landscape, or maybe there's a series of stewards, and maybe there's intrinsic motivation too, right, as a lever. Maybe there's more, because I probably haven't dug deep or wide enough into this topic, but I think there's lots of different elements to this. And an interesting question I've got in my mind is, while we need farmers to be paid to make the business models viable, if we're thinking at a wider scale, what would it look like to have people, stewards, who are thinking beyond carbon or one particular outcome, and thinking about multiple outcomes, who are actually intrinsically motivated to steward things? How would that look? What would that look like? What would the conditions need to be for that to happen? And is there actually a lever like over here, which actually enables that to happen? And we can actually pull something else that enables, four crazy people to be like, we're actually just going to fundamentally like steward this landscape and provide multiple of these sort of 14 ecosystem services that people talk about. That's some of the other elements I see. But I also welcome challenges to that thinking, because it's possible it's off base also.
All right, we're nearing the end. I was also thinking about insurances, and then specifically around water, for example. And I've heard of maybe a romanticized, and maybe even you told me, Koen, the Italian village. It's probably you then. Italian village, but having a lot of problems with water damage, and I think that's a big thing. And transitioning to a different type of farming, being able to hold more water, the land holding more water, causing less damage in the area by floods, etc., which is actually then an ecosystem service that can decrease the need for insurances to pay out and actually have constructions. So I think that's what you're mentioning as well, like additional services that come out of a different way of farming. It's not always related to actually buying a carbon credit. There's a tons of ways to do that differently. I think it's interesting. Very quick question, because I posted and then we need to wrap up. Maybe Olivier or Koen. Olivier is now in the dark. The thing about the corporates that I post, do they see it happening? Do they see this buzz actually translating in corporates reaching out to buy stuff from these pioneers in Europe?
It seems to be, but yeah, let's keep them accountable to the premiums and because they need to put some money on the table, and probably to long-term contracts and to, hey, we have a very young attendee as well, to long-term contracts, different kind of transparency and openness. I think that's gonna hit the heart of their business model that's not made on openness and transparency. So very hopeful, and at the same time we need to hold them absolutely accountable to this, and otherwise sell it somewhere else, because the demand is there for a number of these products. The demand is definitely there for regeneratively grown almonds or almonds grown with regenerative practices, for a number of alternative proteins. Like the demand is off the charts. As long as they're organic, you can get insane premiums. So the demand is there, and the question is who's going to buy. And many of these farmers, very honestly, they can choose who to sell to. So they're in the position of choosing their channels, and they can choose channels that fit them better. And that might not be the Danones or the Nestle's and others. It might be channels that develop themselves, or like these, many of they choose for freedom in a sense, but they also choose their own channels and not be stuck in certain contracts that don't fit them. So let's hope more of the power shifts back to the countryside and to the farmers. But cool. Everybody benefits from healthy ecosystems and landscapes. So it's that message starts to slowly, I mean, not at the COP, but so slowly settle in that we cannot live without healthy landscapes, and farmers are the stewards of those landscapes.
I think that's a great way to end this session.
Olivier wanted to say something.
Olivier, you wanted to add?
I cut him off.
No, let's end on that note, because we'll enter into a whole other conversation.
Whole other world.
Let's keep it simple like this.
Koen briefly mentioning the COP, and we didn't get into it. But yeah, other than that, I think nice to have this conversation again. Thank you all for coming. We, from Fresh Ventures perspective, we try to build new ventures to accelerate this transition, and actually we are getting started next week. So we have been quite occupied so far. Some of the potential founders that are going to set up new businesses are actually in this call right now, which is great. We will try to keep you posted on what's happening there, and we would invite you all also to get involved in us trying to figure out what are the relevant problems to focus on, what are interesting solutions to work on. Any way you can get involved, best way to do so is following us on LinkedIn. We are very open in sharing our knowledge and what we learn, but also very open to learn from others. Also you, Koen, I want to thank you again. I want to recommend everyone to check out the podcast as well, obviously. What's coming out, and Koen, can you tell us what's coming up in the podcast?
We just put something online on regen technologies, so taking it beyond food and ag, which is fascinating. So we do talk about cellular meat, and we do talk about some of the more touchy subjects. We have Satish Kumar talking about the need to be in nature and the need for farming, one of the founders of Schumacher College, and an update with SLM partners, Paul McMahon, in a few weeks, that are raising a new fund focused on Europe, 250 million, focused on agroforestry and forestry. And a lot more that I cannot remember at the moment. So we have maybe an episode a week and probably more coming.
And the Q&A, did you mention the Q&A? So the Q&A on the...
Yeah, so we have actually, if you're interested in food as medicine, we have a Q&A webinar with the writers of a report. Thank you for bringing it up. The white paper on the nexus between human health and regenerative agriculture, David Lezaks and Mandy Ellerton are coming on a Q&A at 4 p.m. Central European time. I'll put the link in the chat on Monday. So coming up Monday, we still have some spots left if you're interested in food as medicine, nutrient density, and where does the current science and practice stand.
No, that's crazy interesting. I look forward to that, Koen. So thanks again, everyone, for being part of this. We'll try to host another one in December, announce it via the LinkedIn, and yeah, look forward to next time. Have a great evening, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.